Hello everyone, and welcome back to Trail of Secret. I know many of you use these videos to unwind and drift off to sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from around the world. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get into tonight's story. Story number 1. It all began on a chilly Thursday evening, the kind of night where the air feels heavy and the shadows seem to stretch just a little further than usual. I had just finished work and decided to stop by a local diner for a quick meal before heading home. The place wasn't much to look at. Faded red booths, a flickering neon sign outside, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. But it had the best coffee in town, and a comforting, greasy menu that hit the spot after a long day. The diner was nearly empty when I walked in. A lone trucker sat in a booth near the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street, and an older couple was quietly sharing a slice of pie at the counter. I slid into a booth near the back and ordered my usual, a grilled cheese sandwich, and a cup of black coffee. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. As I waited, I pulled out my phone to scroll through the news. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was oddly soothing, and the soft clatter of dishes from the kitchen added a sense of normalcy. But then, something caught my attention. A man walked in, shaking off the rain from his jacket. He wasn't particularly remarkable. Average height, dark hair, and a face you'd forget in a crowd. But there was something about the way he moved that unsettled me. He scanned the room with sharp eyes before taking a seat at the booth directly across from mine. I tried to ignore him, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Every so often, I'd glance up from my phone, only to find his eyes fixed on me. Not in a casual passing way. His gaze was intense, almost calculating. It sent a chill down my spine. The waitress brought my food, breaking the tension for a moment. I thanked her and tried to focus on eating, but the man's presence was impossible to ignore. He hadn't ordered anything, just sat there, his hands folded neatly on the table. The trucker and the older couple seemed oblivious, their attention elsewhere. After a while, the man stood up and walked toward the counter. I breathed a small sigh of relief, thinking he might leave. But instead, he spoke quietly to the waitress, and she nodded, handing him a napkin and a pen. He scribbled something down, then turned and walked back to his booth. As he passed my table, he slipped the napkin onto it without a word. I stared at it, my appetite forgotten. My heart pounded as I unfolded the napkin. 3 words were scrawled in hurried, uneven handwriting. "You're in danger." I looked up, but the man was already gone. The bell above the diner door jingled softly, and I caught a glimpse of him disappearing into the rain. My mind raced. Was this some kind of joke? A prank? But the seriousness in his eyes told me otherwise. I glanced around the diner, hoping for some kind of explanation. But the trucker and the older couple were still in their own worlds, and the waitress was busy refilling coffee cups. I decided to leave. My hands trembled as I paid my bill and stepped outside into the cold night. The rain had let up, but the air was damp and heavy. I hurried to my car, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The parking lot was eerily quiet, save for the sound of water dripping from the eaves of the diner. As I reached my car, I noticed something strange. A small piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. My stomach churned as I plucked it free and unfolded it. This note was shorter than the first, but just as unsettling. Don't go home. Panic set in. My first instinct was to call the police. But what would I tell them? That a stranger in a diner had given me cryptic warnings? It sounded absurd. Instead, I decided to drive to a friend's house a few miles away. It felt safer than going home, at least for the moment. The drive was nerve-wracking. Every car that appeared in my rearview mirror felt like a potential threat. The shadows along the road seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on my mind. By the time I reached my friend's house, I was on edge. She greeted me with concern, but I brushed it off, claiming I just needed a place to crash for the night. I didn't tell her about the notes or the man at the diner. I didn't want to scare her or seem paranoid. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jump, and I kept replaying the events of the evening in my head, searching for answers. Who was that man? How did he know I was in danger? And why had he chosen to warn me? The next morning, I decided to return to the diner. I needed to speak to the waitress, see if she knew anything about the man. But when I arrived, the place was closed. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Closed until further notice." A sinking feeling settled in my chest. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Taped to the door was another note, written in the same hurried handwriting as the others. "It's not over." I stood there, frozen, as the weight of those words sank in. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. And for the first time in my life, I truly felt the chill of fear take hold. Story 2. It was another quiet evening when I decided to stop by my favorite coffee shop, a cozy little place tucked away at the end of a bustling street. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of conversations always gave me a sense of comfort after long, exhausting days. That night, though, something felt different. The usual warmth of the place seemed to carry an edge of unease, a tension I couldn't quite place. I pushed the thought aside as I stepped inside, the familiar bell above the door chiming softly. The place wasn't crowded, just a few regulars scattered across the tables, each absorbed in their own little worlds. A couple by the window was laughing quietly, their heads close together. A man in a suit was typing furiously on his laptop in the corner. A nearly empty espresso cup beside him. The barista, a cheerful young woman named Mia, greeted me with her usual bright smile. "Hey, back again?" she asked, her tone light and friendly. I smiled back, nodding. "You know me. Same order, please." She set to work on my drink, and I leaned against the counter, letting my gaze wander. That's when I noticed him. Sitting alone at a table, near the back, was a man I'd never seen before. He was dressed in dark, unremarkable clothing, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about him caught my attention. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, his hands resting on the table, as though waiting for something, or someone. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, yet his presence seemed to command attention. I quickly looked away, feeling a bit foolish for letting my imagination run wild. Mia handed me my coffee, and I took it to my usual spot by the fireplace. I pulled out my laptop, intending to catch up on some work, but my focus kept drifting back to the stranger. He hadn't moved since I'd first noticed him, and now it seemed as though he were watching the room, his gaze sweeping over each person with an unsettling precision. Minutes passed, and the air in the cafe grew heavier. Even the laughter from the couple by the window seemed subdued, their voices lowering to hushed whispers. The man in the corner closed his laptop abruptly, casting a nervous glance toward the stranger before hurrying out of the shop. It felt as though an invisible thread connected all of us in the room, a shared awareness of the tension that had settled over us. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on my screen, but it was no use. My curiosity got the better of me. I glanced up again, only to find that the stranger's table was empty. My heart skipped a beat. Where had he gone? I hadn't heard the door chime, hadn't seen him leave. A cold prickle of fear crawled up my neck, looking for someone. Mia's voice startled me, and I nearly spilled my coffee. She stood beside me, a concerned look on her face. No, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Just thought I saw someone I knew. She didn't look convinced, but didn't press the issue. As she walked back to the counter, I decided it was time to leave. The uneasy atmosphere was starting to get to me, and I told myself it was all in my head. I packed up my things and headed for the door. The night air was crisp and cool, a welcome relief after the stifling tension inside. The street was quieter than usual, the sounds of the city muted, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I started walking toward my car, parked a few blocks away. The comforting glow of streetlights guided my way, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Halfway to my car, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder, my pulse quickening. The street was empty. I told myself it was just the echo of my own steps. But when I started walking again, the sound followed, perfectly in sync with my movements. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. The footsteps quickened too. Panic surged through me as I turned a corner, searching for somewhere, anywhere, to hide. That's when I saw him. The stranger from the coffee shop was standing at the end of the alley, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, blocking my path. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound firm. He took a step forward, and I instinctively stepped back. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. There was no one else around, no one to call for help. The street behind me was a dead end, and the only way out was past him. Before I could react, he raised a hand, holding something small and metallic. My breath caught in my throat. Was it a weapon? I braced myself for the worst. Every muscle in my body tensed to run, but then he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "You dropped this," he said, holding out my wallet. I stared at him in disbelief, the tension draining from my body as confusion took its place. My wallet? I hadn't even realized it was missing. Cautiously, I stepped forward and took it from him, my fingers brushing against his gloved hand. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing into the night as quickly as he'd appeared. I stood there for a long moment, clutching my wallet and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The fear, the tension, the inexplicable sense of dread, all of it had evaporated in an instant, leaving me feeling foolish for overreacting. And yet, something about the encounter still didn't sit right. When I got home, I opened my wallet to make sure everything was there. My ID, credit cards, and cash were all accounted for. But tucked behind one of the bills was a small slip of paper I didn't recognize. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 3 words: "Don't trust him." My mind raced with questions. Who had written the note? Was it the stranger? And if so, who was he warning me about? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger, something I didn't yet understand. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside my window, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't stop thinking about the stranger, about the note, about the sense of unease that had followed me from the coffee shop. Deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever was happening, it had only just begun. Story number 3. It was a chilly Friday evening, and the golden hues of the sunset were giving way to the deep purples of twilight. After a long, tiring week at work, I had decided to treat myself to a rare evening out at a quaint little cafe I'd recently discovered. The place had a reputation for its cozy atmosphere and the best chai latte in town, which I was eager to try. As I stepped inside, a small brass bell above the door jingled softly, announcing my arrival. The interior was just as inviting as I'd imagined. Warm lighting, rustic wooden furniture, and the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. A handful of patrons occupied the tables, most of them engrossed in their own worlds, reading, typing on laptops, or chatting quietly with friends. It felt like a haven, separate from the bustling chaos of the city outside. I chose a table near the window, which offered a view of the cobblestone street, bathed in the glow of vintage-style lampposts. A young waitress approached me with a friendly smile, her notepad in hand. "What can I get for you tonight?" she asked. "I'll have a chai latte, please," I replied, returning her smile. "Coming right up," she said, jotting down my order before disappearing behind the counter. As I waited, I pulled out my phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through social media. It was then that I noticed him, a man seated a few tables away, directly in my line of sight. He was dressed in a dark, well-tailored coat, and his sharp features were partially obscured by the low brim of his hat. There was something about him that caught my attention, not just his appearance, but the way he carried himself. He seemed too still, too composed, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. I glanced away quickly, not wanting to be caught staring, but my curiosity was piqued. When my chai latte arrived, I thanked the waitress and took a sip, savoring the comforting warmth and rich spices. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's presence was significant in some way. Minutes turned into an hour as I nursed my drink, occasionally glancing at the mysterious man. He hadn't moved much, except to sip from his cup and adjust the brim of his hat. And then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that he was probably just another patron minding his own business, he did something that sent a chill down my spine. He looked directly at me. It wasn't a casual glance or an accidental meeting of eyes. His gaze was deliberate, piercing, and unnervingly intense. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I felt as if he could see right through me, as if he knew something about me that I didn't. I quickly averted my eyes, pretending to be engrossed in my phone, but the damage was done. My sense of comfort had been replaced by a gnawing unease. When I finally mustered the courage to look up again, he was gone. His chair was empty, his cup cleared away. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I scanned the cafe, but there was no sign of him. The waitress, sensing my confusion, approached my table. "Is everything okay?" she asked kindly. "That man who was sitting over there," I said, gesturing to the now empty table. "Do you know where he went?" She frowned, glancing at the table I'd indicated. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember anyone sitting there recently." "Are you sure?" Her response only deepened my unease. I nodded slowly, deciding not to press the issue further. After paying for my drink, I left the cafe, the cool night air biting at my cheeks as I made my way home. The streets were quieter now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if they were alive. Halfway down the block, I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and measured, matching my pace with unsettling precision. I glanced over my shoulder, but the sidewalk was empty. Quickening my steps, I reached for my keys, clutching them tightly in my hand like a makeshift weapon. The footsteps continued, unrelenting. My heart raced as I turned a corner, hoping to lose whoever was following me. But when I looked back again, there was still no one there. The air felt heavier, and the distant sound of a clock tower striking 9 seemed unnaturally loud, echoing through the deserted streets. Finally, I reached my apartment building. Fumbling with the lock, I let myself in and bolted the door behind me. The familiar surroundings of my home should have brought comfort, but the lingering feeling of being watched refused to fade. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of the man in the cafe. Who was he? Why had he looked at me like that? And why had the waitress claimed not to have seen him? The questions swirled in my mind, refusing to let me sleep. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the sound of footsteps echoing in empty corridors. And through it all, I kept hearing a voice, whispering words I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't until I woke up, drenched in sweat, that I realized the voice had been saying the same thing over and over. Be careful. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, as I tried to convince myself it was just a dream. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. Somewhere out there, the man in the cafe was still watching, waiting, and I had a feeling our paths would cross again. Story number 4. It was a rainy evening, and the city streets shimmered under the glow of streetlights. I had just left my office and was making my way home. The steady rhythm of raindrops on my umbrella and the occasional sound of cars splashing through puddles filled the air. The day had been long, and all I wanted was to get home, change into something comfortable, and unwind with a cup of tea. As I walked along the dimly lit path, a strange sensation came over me, a feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, like the faint brush of a breeze against your skin, but it quickly grew more intense. I glanced over my shoulder, my heartbeat quickening, but the street behind me was empty. Only the soft drizzle and the faint hum of the city surrounded me. Shaking off the unease, I continued walking, convincing myself that it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. Yet, with every step I took, the sensation grew stronger. My ears strained to catch any sound that might betray the presence of another person, but there was only the persistent patter of rain. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps. They were distant, almost lost in the rain, but unmistakably there. My pulse raced as I tried to stay calm. I quickened my pace, my shoes splashing against the wet pavement. The footsteps behind me seemed to match my pace, growing louder and more distinct. I turned a corner, hoping to lose whoever was following me. The alley I entered was narrower and darker, flanked by tall buildings on either side. The rain seemed louder here, the sound bouncing off the walls. I glanced back again, but saw no one. Relieved, but still uneasy, I continued walking, my senses on high alert. As I neared the end of the alley, a figure emerged from the shadows. My heart leapt into my throat. It was a man, tall and dressed in a dark raincoat with a hood pulled low over his face. He stood there silently, blocking my path. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to sound confident despite the fear creeping into my voice. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The rain seemed to fall harder, the sound drowning out everything else. Suddenly, the man took a step forward. That was all it took. for my body to spring into action. I spun on my heel and ran back the way I had come. My umbrella fell from my hand as I sprinted through the rain-soaked alley, my breaths coming in sharp gasps. The footsteps behind me were loud and fast, echoing off the narrow walls. Whoever he was chasing me, and he was getting closer. Panic surged through me as I searched for a way out. The main street was still several blocks away, and I wasn't sure if I could make it. I spotted a side door to one of the buildings and darted toward it, praying it would be unlocked. Luck was on my side. The door gave way, and I slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The hallway I had entered was dimly lit and eerily quiet. The faint hum of fluorescent lights was the only sound. I took a moment to compose myself before cautiously moving deeper into the building. It appeared to be some sort of old office complex, the kind that had seen better days. I wandered through the empty corridors, searching for another exit. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. "You can't hide forever." A cold chill ran down my spine. How had they gotten my number? Was it the man who had been chasing me? I looked around, half expecting him to appear out of the shadows. The building suddenly felt much smaller, its walls closing in on me. I dialed 911, my hands trembling. The call connected, but before I could say anything, the line went dead. My phone's screen flickered and then turned off completely, leaving me in silence. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to find a way out of this building and get to safety. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Every creak of the floorboards and every distant sound set my nerves on edge. As I turned a corner, I saw him. The man in the raincoat was standing at the end of the hallway, his face still obscured by the hood. He didn't move, but I could feel his gaze locked on me. I bolted, taking random turns, trying to lose him in the maze-like corridors. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, my breaths ragged. I found a stairwell and rushed down it, hoping it would lead to an exit. The stairwell was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew. I descended quickly, skipping steps in my haste. At the bottom, I found another door. This one led to a basement. Desperation drove me forward. The basement was dimly lit, with rows of old filing cabinets and dusty shelves. I ducked behind one of the shelves, trying to catch my breath and collect my thoughts. The sound of footsteps echoed in the stairwell above. He was still following me. I could hear the slow, deliberate pace of his steps as he descended. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. I needed to find something to defend myself with. My eyes scanned the room, landing on a rusted metal pipe lying on the floor. I picked it up, the cold metal heavy in my hands. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I held my breath, gripping the pipe tightly. The man's silhouette appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He paused, as if listening, before stepping into the room. I stayed hidden, my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he chasing me? The questions swirled in my mind, but there was no time for answers. I had to act. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped out from behind the shelf and swung the pipe with all my strength. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man stumbled back, clutching his side. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. I ran past him, up the stairs, and out of the building. The rain had stopped, and the streets were eerily quiet. I didn't stop running until I reached a busy main road. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night or who that man was. All I know is that I escaped, but the memory of his shadowy figure and the relentless chase will haunt me forever. Story number 5. It was a cold, rainy evening when I decided to take a different route home. The usual path was blocked by roadwork, and I was already running late after a grueling day at the office. The street I turned onto was eerily quiet, lined with old buildings whose windows were mostly boarded up. The glow of the streetlights barely cut through the heavy mist that hung in the air. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, convincing myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the surroundings. But as I walked, the sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the street were amplifying the noise. Then I heard it. Second set of footsteps. Faint at first, then growing louder, matching my pace perfectly. I stopped abruptly and turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The street was empty. Only the mist and the dim streetlights greeted me. I laughed nervously, chastising myself for being so jumpy. It had to be my imagination, or perhaps the sound of water dripping from the rooftops. I picked up my pace, eager to get home. The footsteps returned. This time, they were unmistakable. They weren't just an echo of my own steps. They were deliberate, heavy, and closing in. I glanced over my shoulder, my breath hitching. A shadow moved at the edge of the fog, too far away to make out clearly, but close enough to feel menacing. My mind raced. Should I run? Should I confront whoever it was? My pulse quickened as I weighed my options. I decided to keep walking. Faster now, but not quite running. Showing fear felt like a mistake. The shadow remained in the corner of my vision, keeping pace with me. My hands trembled as I fished my phone out of my pocket, but the screen was unresponsive. Panic surged as I realized the battery had died. I cursed under my breath and clutched my bag tightly, hoping it could serve as a makeshift weapon if things took a turn for the worse. As I turned a corner, I spotted a small convenience store up ahead. Its neon sign flickered weakly, but it was a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. I practically ran to the door and pushed it open, the bell above it jangling loudly. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast an artificial brightness over the cramped aisles. The clerk, an older man with a weary expression, looked up from his newspaper. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened. "I think someone might be following me," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The clerk's brow furrowed, and he glanced toward the door. "You sure? Could just be your imagination. This area can be unsettling at night." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. "Can I stay here for a bit?" "Of course," he said, gesturing to a stool near the counter. "Take your time." I perched on the stool, my eyes glued to the glass door. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. No one entered. The street outside was still and silent. Slowly, I began to relax, convincing myself that I'd overreacted. Perhaps it really had been my imagination. Just as I was about to thank the clerk and leave, the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in, his face obscured by a hood. He moved with a casualness that seemed forced, his hands buried deep in his pockets. My stomach churned as I recognized the heavy boots, the same sound I'd heard following me. The clerk greeted him, but the man barely acknowledged him. Instead, he walked to the back of the store, pretending to browse. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The man lingered in the back aisle, his movements deliberate but aimless, as if he were waiting for something. "You okay?" the clerk whispered to me, noticing my pale complexion. "That's him," I managed to say, my voice trembling. The clerk's eyes narrowed, and he gave a barely perceptible nod. He reached under the counter and pulled out a phone, dialing a number with swift precision. Just stay calm, he murmured, his tone steady. We'll handle this. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The man continued to loiter, his presence a dark cloud that filled the small store. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked out, the bell jingling softly in his wake. I exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over me. The police are on their way, the clerk said. You should wait here until they arrive. I nodded, too shaken to argue. When the officers arrived, they took my statement and reviewed the store's security footage. The man's face was never fully visible, but his actions were enough to raise suspicion. They promised to patrol the area and advised me to be cautious in the future. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed sinister, every noise amplified. I avoided that street altogether. Even during the day, the experience had left a mark, a lingering sense of vulnerability that refused to fade. To this day, I don't know who the man was or why he followed me, but his presence served as a chilling reminder of how quickly the mundane can turn into something terrifying. I learned to trust my instincts that night, to listen to the whispers of unease that so often go ignored. And while I may never have answers, I'm grateful to the clerk who believed me when I needed it most. Story number 6. It was a late autumn evening, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of deep purple and orange. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my feet as I walked home from the local library. I had stayed later than I intended, losing track of time as I immersed myself in research for a work project. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing by, its headlights briefly illuminating the dim sidewalks. As I turned down a quieter street, lined with old Victorian houses, I noticed a peculiar sound. At first it was faint, like the soft hum of distant machinery. But as I continued walking, it grew louder. It was rhythmic, almost like a low-pitched whirring mixed with an occasional click. I slowed my pace, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. The sound seemed to be coming from an abandoned house on the corner, a house I'd passed countless times before without much thought. The house had a reputation in the neighborhood. It was said to be cursed, with rumors of its last owner vanishing mysteriously nearly a decade ago. The windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. Tonight, however, a faint light flickered behind one of the boarded windows on the second floor. My stomach tightened with unease, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, pretending to tie my shoelace near the gate so I could observe without appearing suspicious. The whirring noise continued, now accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices. It was hard to tell if they were human or something else entirely. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my phone and snapped a quick picture of the house. As the flash went off, I froze. The noise stopped abruptly, and the faint light in the window vanished. For a moment, everything was eerily silent. Then, a shadow moved behind the boards of the window. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, my heart pounding. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. I spun around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the empty street and a few parked cars. Shaking my head, I muttered to myself, "It's just your imagination," and hurried away from the house. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me and double-checked all the windows. The feeling of unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure. I sat down to review the photo I had taken, but when I opened my phone's gallery, the picture wasn't there. It was as if it had been deleted. My hands trembled slightly as I tried to convince myself it was a technical glitch. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, and by the time I went to bed, I had almost convinced myself that the strange encounter was just a mix of paranoia and exhaustion. But that night, I dreamed of the house. In my dream, I was standing in front of it again, but this time, the front door was wide open. A figure stood in the doorway, its features obscured by shadows. It raised a hand and beckoned me forward. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The dream ended abruptly, and I woke up drenched in sweat. Over the next few days, I tried to put the incident behind me, but strange things started happening. I'd come home to find my belongings slightly out of place. A chair moved, a book lying open on the table, when I was certain I'd left it closed. At first, I thought I was being forgetful, but the incidents became harder to dismiss. One evening, I returned from work to find my front door unlocked. I was certain I had locked it that morning. I called a locksmith the next day to replace the locks, but even that didn't ease my growing paranoias. The final straw came when I found a small, folded piece of paper tucked under my pillow. Written on it, in neat but unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "You shouldn't have looked." I felt my blood run cold. I immediately checked the house from top to bottom, but found no signs of forced entry. The windows were locked, and there was no way anyone could have gotten inside. Feeling desperate, I decided to go back to the abandoned house. I needed answers. This time, I went during the day, hoping the light would make the place feel less intimidating. The house loomed before me, its presence as unsettling as ever. The whirring noise was gone, and the boards on the windows looked undisturbed, summoning every ounce of courage. I pushed open the creaky gate and walked up the overgrown path to the front door. To my surprise, it was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was stale, and the floors creaked under my weight. The house was empty, filled only with broken furniture and layers of dust. I climbed the staircase to the second floor, where I had seen the light that night. The room with the boarded window was bare, except for a single chair placed in the center. On the chair was an old cassette recorder. My heart raced as I pressed play. The tape began with the same whirring noise I had heard before, followed by faint, distorted voices. Then a man's voice spoke clearly. "You were warned. Curiosity can be dangerous." The tape clicked off, and at that moment, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. Panic set in, and I bolted out of the house, not stopping until I was back in my car. I've never returned to that street, and I moved out of the neighborhood shortly after. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that house, but the warning was clear. Some secrets are better left undiscovered. Story number 7. It started on a crisp autumn evening. I was driving back home after a long day at work. The golden hues of the setting sun casting an otherworldly glow over the winding road. The forest surrounding the highway was dense, with towering trees whose branches stretched out like skeletal arms, casting eerie shadows across the pavement. I had always enjoyed driving through this stretch. There was something soothing about the isolation, the hum of my car's engine blending with the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But that evening, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an almost tangible sense of unease. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on my overactive imagination. After all, I'd been listening to true crime podcasts all day, and it wasn't unusual for the stories to linger in my mind. Still, I couldn't help but glance at my rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see something unusual, but the road behind me was empty, a dark ribbon stretching into the horizon. As I rounded a particularly sharp curve, my headlights caught something, a figure standing at the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat as I instinctively slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, her clothes tattered and her hair disheveled. She stood motionless, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she stared straight at my car. For a moment, I considered driving past her. There was something unsettling about her presence, something that made every instinct scream at me to keep going. But then I thought, what if she needed help? What if she'd been in an accident or was in danger? I pulled over, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as I debated whether to get out of the car. Before I could make a decision, she began to move, her steps slow and deliberate as she approached my vehicle. Her face came into view, illuminated by the glow of my headlights. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. I rolled down the window slightly, just enough to hear her. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze darting nervously to the trees behind her. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, she placed a hand on the edge of my car door, her fingers trembling. "Please, you have to help me. They'll find me if I stay here." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors and motioned for her to get in. As soon as she was inside, I hit the gas, the tires screeching slightly as I pulled back onto the road. She sank into the passenger seat, her body tense, and her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see someone following us. "Who are you running from?" I asked, glancing at her briefly, before returning my focus to the road. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said, her voice shaking. "Try me," I insisted. She hesitated, her hands clutching the fabric of her skirt tightly. "They're not human." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a terror that was impossible to fake. "They look human, but they're not. They've been hunting me for days. They don't stop. They don't sleep. And if they catch me," her voice broke, and she looked away, unable to finish the sentence. A million thoughts raced through my mind. Was she delusional? Paranoid? Or was there a grain of truth in her words? I didn't know what to believe, but her fear was contagious. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind us was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Where should I take you?" I asked. "Just keep driving," she replied. "I'll tell you when it's safe to stop." The miles stretched on, the silence in the car broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves. Outside, every now and then, she would glance out the window, her body tensing as if she expected something to leap out of the darkness. I wanted to ask more questions, to understand what was happening, but the fear in her eyes kept me silent. After what felt like hours, she finally spoke. "There's a motel up ahead. Pull in there." I did as she asked, my nerves on edge as I parked the car. The motel was old and run down, its neon sign flickering weakly. She hesitated before stepping out of the car, her eyes scanning the area cautiously. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this." Before I could respond, she turned and hurried toward the motel's entrance. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to follow her or drive away. Part of me wanted to leave, to put as much distance between myself and whatever danger she was running from. But another part of me needed answers. I decided to wait. Minutes turned into an hour, and there was still no sign of her. Just as I was about to give up and leave, I saw movement in the shadows near the edge of the parking lot. My heart raced as I squinted, trying to make out what it was. Slowly, a figure emerged. Tall, humanoid, but wrong. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. I froze, my mind racing as the figure turned its head, its gaze locking onto my car. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the keys, starting the engine just as the figure began to move toward me. I didn't wait to see what it would do. Slamming my foot on the gas, I sped out of the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. Drove for hours. The image of that figure burned into my mind. I didn't know what it was, or what it wanted, but one thing was certain. The woman had been telling the truth, and whatever those things were, they were still out there, waiting, hunting. To this day, I don't know what became of her, but sometimes, when I'm driving down an empty road at night, I can't help but glance at the shadows, half expecting to see one of those figures watching me from the darkness. Story number 8. The air was damp and cold as I made my way down the abandoned railway tunnel. My footsteps echoed against the stone walls, accompanied only by the faint drip of water seeping through cracks in the ceiling. It was an eerie setting, one I would have avoided under any other circumstances. But curiosity has a way of driving people into places they'd rather not go. It started a week earlier when a co-worker, Andrew, casually mentioned the tunnel during a lunch break. People say it's haunted, he said with a smirk, stirring his coffee. There's a story about a train accident from decades ago. Passengers who didn't survive. Well, some believe their spirits never left. I laughed it off at the time, but something about his words stayed with me. Maybe it was the way he said it, with just enough intrigue to plant the seed of curiosity. Or maybe it was because Andrew, known for his no-nonsense attitude, didn't seem to be joking. Whatever it was, by the end of the week, I found myself driving out to the old railway station with nothing but a flashlight and a camera. The tunnel stretched ahead, its darkness swallowing the faint beam of my flashlight. Rusted tracks ran along the ground, overgrown with moss and weeds. Every now and then, I stopped to take pictures, though my unease made me quicken my pace each time. The further I went, the quieter the world seemed to become, as if the tunnel had its own set of rules, a place apart from the living. I had walked about a mile when I noticed something unusual. The air felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. The drips of water had stopped, and an unsettling silence took their place. Then, I heard it, a faint sound, like whispers, carried on the wind. I froze, straining to listen. It was coming from deeper within the tunnel. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing endlessly. The whispers stopped. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I wanted to turn back, but the thought of leaving without understanding what I had heard felt unbearable. So, I pressed on, gripping my flashlight tightly. My camera dangled from my neck. Forgotten. Another 100 yards in, I came across something that made my heart skip a beat. A rusty, decayed train car sat on the tracks, its once bright paint now faded and peeling. The windows were shattered, and the interior was cloaked in shadows. It didn't belong here. There hadn't been an operational train in this area for decades. I hesitated, Before stepping closer, my flashlight beam revealed torn seats, broken glass, and rusted metal. But what caught my attention was a newspaper lying on one of the seats. It looked oddly pristine, as if it had been placed there recently. I picked it up carefully, noticing the date, October 12th, 1984. The headline read, "Tragedy strikes. Train derails in tunnel, 23 dead." The whispers began again. This time, they were louder, clearer, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Some crying, some pleading, others too garbled to understand. My flashlight flickered, and my pulse quickened. I spun around, expecting to see something, but the tunnel remained empty. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Panic set in, and I stumbled backward, tripping over the tracks. I hit the ground hard, my flashlight skidding out of reach. Darkness enveloped me. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed the flashlight and swung its beam wildly around the tunnel. That's when I saw them. Faint, translucent figures moving toward me. Their features were blurred, their forms shifting, as if they were caught between this world and the next. They reached out with hands that seemed to dissolve into the air. "Leave," a voice whispered directly into my ear, though no one was there. It was cold, sharp, and full of warning. I didn't need to be told twice. Clutching my flashlight, I bolted back the way I had come. The tunnel seemed longer now, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers followed me, growing fainter the further I ran. By the time I reached the entrance, I was gasping for air, my heart pounding like a drum. Outside, the night felt strangely warm, a stark contrast to the chill of the tunnel. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there, trembling. My flashlight lay on the passenger seat, and the newspaper was still clutched in my hand. For days, I couldn't shake the experience. I debated going back, if only to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I had encountered in that tunnel wasn't something I wanted to face again. And yet, the whispers still echo in my mind, a haunting reminder of the things that linger in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. Sometimes, curiosity is a dangerous thing. Story number 9. It all began when I decided to revisit the small town where I'd spent my childhood summers. Nestled in a remote corner of the countryside, the town was quiet and unassuming, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. I had always found comfort in its simplicity, but this time, my return brought an unsettling discovery. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was painted in hues of gold and crimson as the sun began its descent. After checking into a modest bed and breakfast, I took a stroll through the old streets, memories flooding back with each step. But there was one place I avoided as a child, a place whispered about in hushed tones. The old asylum on the outskirts of town. The asylum, abandoned for decades, was a source of endless urban legends. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed that the spirits of its forgotten patients still lingered within its crumbling walls. As a kid, I'd never dared to go near it. But as an adult, my curiosity had grown stronger. That evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the overgrown path that led to its gates. The path was barely visible, choked by wild vines and tall grass, with the faint light of my flashlight guiding me. I ventured forward. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, their skeletal branches casting eerie shadows. Finally, I reached the gates, which hung loosely on rusted hinges. Beyond them stood the asylum, a monolithic structure, cloaked in darkness and decay. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the place felt inherently wrong, as if it were alive and watching me. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the gates. The courtyard was littered with debris, shattered glass, broken furniture, and fragments of old medical equipment. The building's facade was weathered and crumbling, its windows like empty eye sockets, staring into the void. I pushed open the main door, which groaned loudly, echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of mildew and rot. The floor was strewn with papers, many of them patient records, their ink faded and smudged. I picked one up and scanned its contents. It detailed the treatment of a young woman named Eleanor, who had been admitted in 1932 for severe hallucinations. Scribbled in the margins were notes from a doctor, describing her as beyond help. As I moved deeper into the asylum, the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the occasional drip of water. The hallways were lined with rooms, their doors ajar, revealing rusted beds and peeling wallpaper. It was as if time had stood still, preserving the misery of those who had once lived here. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The whisper stopped, replaced by the sound of shuffling footsteps. They seemed to be coming from the floor above. Against my better judgment, I climbed the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing like a warning. The upper floor was darker, the windows boarded up, and the air colder. I followed the sound of the footsteps, which led me to a large room at the end of the hall. The room appeared to have been a communal area, with broken chairs and tables scattered about. In the center of the room stood a wheelchair, its leather seat cracked and torn. As I approached it, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Then, the whispers returned, louder this time, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. I swung my flashlight around, but the beam revealed nothing. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the empty space. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deafening crash came from behind me. I spun around to find that the door I had entered through had slammed shut. Panic set in as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, now accompanied by faint laughter. It sounded like children, their giggles echoing off the walls. I backed away from the door, my flashlight flickering. The shadows seemed to move, growing and shifting as if alive. In my peripheral vision, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her face obscured by a tattered veil. She was dressed in what appeared to be a hospital gown, her frail frame barely visible in the dim light. "Eleanor?" I whispered, recalling the name from the patient record. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward me, its steps slow and deliberate. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. Darkness enveloped the room, and I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. I screamed, fumbling to retrieve the flashlight. When I finally managed to turn it on, the room was empty. The door was open now, swinging gently as if inviting me to leave. I didn't need another invitation. Grabbing my flashlight, I bolted down the hall, down the stairs, and out of the asylum. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my lungs burning and my heart racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the veiled woman haunted me, her presence feeling more real than any ghost story I'd ever heard. The next morning, I decided to do some research on the asylum. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. Eleanor had been one of the last patients admitted before the asylum closed in 1935. She had suffered from severe psychosis, claiming to see and hear things that no one else could. According to the records, she had died under mysterious circumstances. Her body found in the very room I had entered. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that asylum. Was it my imagination, fueled by the eerie atmosphere and the stories I'd heard as a child? Or was there something more? Something that still lingers within those crumbling walls, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in? Whatever the truth may be, I've learned one thing. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Story number 10. It was a chilly autumn evening when I first noticed something unusual about my apartment. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, while leaves swirled in chaotic patterns on the dimly lit streets below. I had always cherished the solitude of my top-floor flat, a quiet sanctuary where the hum of city life was just a distant murmur. But that night, the silence inside felt different, heavy, almost alive. I was curled up on the couch, a mug of tea warming my hands, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. The TV was off, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing there, just the faint outline of my hallway, dimly illuminated by the glow of a small lamp. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the light or my imagination, running wild. After all, I had been working long hours and was probably just overtired. But as the evening wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, an unshakable sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through articles and messages, but my concentration kept slipping. Every now and then, I'd glance toward the hallway, half expecting to see a shadow darting out of sight. Each time, there was nothing. By midnight, the unease had settled into a low thrum of anxiety. I decided it was time to call it a night. As I stood up to head to bed, I heard a faint creak, like the sound of a footstep on wooden floorboards. My apartment had carpeting everywhere, except for the kitchen. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I listened. The sound didn't come again, but the air felt colder, heavier. Clutching my phone tightly, I walked toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen was empty, of course. The overhead light cast harsh shadows on the countertops, but there was no sign of an intruder. I checked the windows and door, both of which were securely locked. Sighing, I tried to laugh at myself for being so jumpy. It was just an old building, I reasoned, settling and groaning as the temperature dropped. Back in the living room, I made sure the front door was bolted and turned off the lights before heading to bed. As I climbed under the covers, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt colder than usual, and the shadows cast by the street lamp outside seemed sharper, more defined. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night, my heart racing. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the direction of the living room. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on a hard surface. Grabbing my phone, I switched on the flashlight and slid out of bed. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I crept toward the living room, every step feeling like a mile. The tapping stopped abruptly as I reached the hallway, plunging the apartment into an eerie silence. I paused, holding my breath, and then slowly rounded the corner. The living room was empty, just as I had left it. The couch, the coffee table, the shelves, everything was in its place. But the uneasy feeling had returned, stronger than before. It felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam catching on the reflective surfaces of picture frames and glass trinkets. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. And then I saw it. On the coffee table, right in the center, was a single, pristine, white feather. My heart stopped. I didn't own anything with feathers, and there was no way it could have drifted in from outside. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and examined it closely. It was smooth and soft, almost glowing in the dim light. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over me, and I had to steady myself against the couch. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, I sat on the couch, with every light in the apartment turned on, clutching the feather like it was some kind of talisman. The tapping didn't return, but the silence felt oppressive, almost deafening. When morning finally came, I left the apartment and spent the day at a coffee shop, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. That evening, I returned home reluctantly, half expecting to find the apartment in disarray. But everything was as I had left it. The feather was still on the coffee table, a stark reminder of the previous night's events. I considered throwing it away, but something stopped me. Instead, I placed it in a small box and tucked it away in a drawer. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. The unease faded, and I started to feel like myself again. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a faint creak in the middle of the night. And sometimes, when I was alone in the living room, I'd feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me. One night, weeks after the first incident, I woke to find the feather lying on my bedside table. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, the memories of that first night flooding back. I hadn't touched the box since I had put it away, and there was no way the feather could have moved on its own. My hands shook as I picked it up, holding it under the light. It looked the same as before, but now it seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly glow. I don't know what's happening in my apartment, or why the feather keeps appearing. But one thing is certain, I'm not alone. Whatever brought that feather into my life is still here, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And each night, as I lie in bed, I wonder if it's getting closer. Story number 11. It was a quiet evening in the heart of the city. The streets were damp from a recent rain, and the soft glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. I was heading home after a long day at work, the exhaustion settling into my bones as I climbed into my car. The drive back to my apartment was uneventful, the kind of monotonous routine that allowed my mind to wander. Yet, tonight felt different, like the air was charged with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I turned onto the main road leading to my neighborhood, I noticed a figure standing under a street lamp. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark trench coat and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. He didn't move, just stood there, with his hands in his pockets, staring at my car as I passed. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off as one of the city's many eccentric characters. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze lingered a little too long. When I arrived home, I parked in my usual spot and made my way to the building's entrance. The lobby was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent light overhead adding to the eerie ambiance. I pressed the elevator button and waited. The hum of the machinery echoed faintly as the elevator descended. Once inside, I pressed the button for my floor and leaned against the wall, closing my eyes for a moment. The ding of the elevator startled me, and I stepped out into the hallway. My apartment was at the end of the corridor, and as I approached, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I was certain I had locked it before leaving that morning. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Had someone broken in? Was there still someone inside? I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, debating whether to call the police. Instead, I decided to take a cautious approach. Pushing the door open with trembling hands, I stepped inside. The living room was untouched, everything in its place. I walked through the apartment, checking each room. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the sense of unease remained. As I double-checked the locks on the windows, I noticed something on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there before. It was a single, folded piece of paper. My name was written on the outside in elegant cursive. I unfolded it carefully, my hands shaking. The note read, "You are not alone. Be vigilant." A chill ran down my spine. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the message was vague, yet deeply unsettling. Who had left this? And how had they gotten into my apartment without leaving a trace? I searched the space again, this time with more urgency, but there was no sign of forced entry, and nothing else out of place. The note was the only clue, and it left me with more questions than answers. The rest of the night was restless. I double-checked all the locks and even propped a chair under the doorknob for added security. Every creak of the building and every gust of wind outside made my heart race. By morning, I felt exhausted, but determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. I decided to visit the building manager to check the security cameras. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man who always seemed to be in the middle of a project. When I explained what had happened, he raised an eyebrow, but agreed to review the footage. Together, we watched the tapes from the previous evening. Everything appeared normal until the footage showed a figure entering the buildings around the time I had left for work. The person was wearing a dark trench coat and a hat, eerily similar to the man I had seen under the street lamp. However, the cameras didn't capture his face clearly. He had entered the elevator and, minutes later, exited on my floor. There was no footage of him leaving the building. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. "Could be someone who knows the building well," the manager muttered. "We'll keep an eye out. Let me know if you notice anything else." I left the office feeling more unsettled than ever. Who was this man? What did he want? And why had he chosen me? The questions weighed heavily on my mind as I went about my day. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. At night, I'd hear faint noises that I couldn't explain. The sense of unease grew with each passing day, and I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. One evening, as I returned home, I found another note waiting for me. This time, it was slipped under my door. The message was even more cryptic. "The answers lie in the past. Trust no one." It was clear now that this wasn't a random act. Someone was deliberately trying to communicate with me, but their intentions remained unclear. I decided to dig deeper, starting with the building's history. A quick online search revealed that the property had been the site of several unusual incidents over the years, including unexplained disappearances and reports of strange figures seen wandering the halls. One particular story caught my attention. Decades ago, a private investigator had lived in the building. He was known for taking on dangerous cases and had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some speculated that he had been silenced by someone he was investigating. Others believed he had uncovered something so dangerous that he had to go into hiding. The more I read, the more I felt a connection between these events and the notes I had received. Was it possible that the figure in the trench coat was somehow tied to this investigator's story? And if so, why was I being drawn into it? That night, I had a vivid dream. I was standing in the building's lobby, but it was different. Older, with antique furnishings and a smoky haze that filled the air. The figure in the trench coat was there, his back turned to me. When he finally faced me, his face was obscured by shadows. He extended his hand, holding a small, leather-bound notebook. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. The dream felt so real, like a memory, rather than a figment of my imagination. I couldn't shake the feeling that it held some significance. Determined to find answers, I decided to search my apartment for anything unusual. I checked every nook and cranny, eventually discovering a loose floorboard in the bedroom closet. Underneath it, I found a small, leather-bound notebook, just like the one from my dream. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches, detailing an investigation into a powerful criminal organization. The name of the private investigator appeared several times, and it was clear that he had been on the verge of exposing something big before he disappeared. As I flipped through the pages, I realized that the notes left in my apartment were references to this investigation. Someone wanted me to continue what the investigator had started. But who? And why me? I sat there, the notebook in my hands, feeling a mix of fear and determination. The mystery was far from over, but one thing was clear. I had been pulled into something much larger than myself, and there was no turning back. Story number 12. It was a cold, foggy evening when I found myself walking through the quiet streets of a small coastal town. The air carried the scent of salt and damp earth, and the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore echoed in the distance. I had been sent here for a work assignment, something routine and uneventful, but the eerie stillness of the place made it feel anything but ordinary. I had rented a small cottage on the edge of town, a charming little place with a creaky wooden porch and a view of the ocean. It seemed like the perfect spot to unwind after long days of work. The locals were friendly enough, though there was something about their smiles that seemed forced. It was as if they were hiding something, an unspoken secret that lingered in the air. After unpacking and settling in, I decided to take a walk down to the beach. The sun had set, and the sky was painted in shades of deep blue and gray. The path leading to the shore was lined with tall grass that swayed in the wind, whispering secrets to the night. As I approached the water, I noticed something peculiar. Faint light flickering in the distance, far out to sea. At first I thought it might be a fishing boat, but the light didn't move like one. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, and seemed to grow brighter with each passing moment. My curiosity got the better of me, and I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the mysterious glow. Eventually, the cold drove me back to the cottage, but I couldn't shake the image of that light from my mind. The next day, I asked a few locals about it, hoping to get an explanation. Most of them shrugged it off, saying it was probably nothing more than a buoy or a distant ship. But one man, an old fisherman with weathered skin and piercing eyes, pulled me aside and whispered, "Stay away from the light. It's not what you think it is." His warning sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. Surely, he was just trying to spook the outsider, right? Still, His words stayed with me as I went about my day. I found myself glancing out toward the ocean every chance I got, searching for any sign of that strange glow. That night, I couldn't resist the urge to return to the beach. The light was there again, brighter than before, and it seemed closer this time. I stood at the water's edge, the icy waves lapping at my feet, and stared out into the darkness. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the wind rustling through the grass and the distant cry of a seagull. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the eerie atmosphere. But as I turned back to the water, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. A figure was emerging from the ocean, silhouetted against the glow of the mysterious light. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. My first thought was that it might be a swimmer or a diver, but as it drew closer, I realized it was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its body was humanoid, but elongated, with limbs that seemed too long and skin that glistened like whetstone. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, the same rhythmic pulse as the one out at sea. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. All I could do was watch as it approached. When it finally reached the shore, it stopped and tilted its head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, in a voice that sounded like the wind itself, it spoke a single word: leave. That was all it took to break the spell. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I was safely inside the cottage, with the doors locked and the windows shuttered. My heart was racing, and my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What had I just seen? And what did it want from me? The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that night. I avoided the beach and stayed away from the water, but the sense of unease never left me. I could feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness, like a shadow that refused to be ignored. One evening, as I was finishing up some paperwork, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. Who could it be at this hour? Hesitantly, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. To my surprise, it was the old fisherman, looked even more weathered than before, and his eyes held a mix of fear and urgency. You saw it, didn't you? He asked as soon as I opened the door. I nodded, unsure of what to say. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and closed the door behind him. You need to leave this place, he said. That thing you saw, it's been here for centuries. It's not human, and it doesn't take kindly to outsiders. I wanted to ask him a million questions, but before I could, he handed me a small, weathered book. Everything you need to know is in here, he said. But whatever you do, don't go back to the beach. Don't go near the water. With that, he turned and left, leaving me alone with the book and a growing sense of dread. I spent the rest of the night poring over its pages, which were filled with accounts of strange sightings, mysterious disappearances, and warnings about the glowing light. The more I read, the more I realized that I was in way over my head. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I packed my things and left the cottage, leaving the key on the kitchen table. As I drove out of town, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The ocean was just a sliver on the horizon, but I could still see the faint glow of the light, pulsing rhythmically, like a heartbeat. I don't know what it was, or why it chose to show itself to me, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget that night. The memory of those glowing eyes and that single, chilling word will haunt me for the rest of my life. And though I'm far away now, safe in the comfort of my own home, I can't help but feel that it's still watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close to the water. Story number 13. It was a cold, damp evening as I drove down the winding road that cut through the dense forest. The headlights of my car barely penetrated the thick fog that seemed to swallow everything around me. It was a drive I had made dozens of times before, but that night, something felt different. The air was heavy, the kind of heaviness that wraps itself around you and refuses to let go. I turned on the radio to break the oppressive silence, but all I got was static. Sighing, I turned it off and focused on the road ahead. The trees loomed like shadowy figures on either side, their skeletal branches reaching out as if trying to grab hold of the car. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping in. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed something odd. A figure was standing by the side of the road, barely visible through the fog. It was a woman, dressed in a long, dark coat, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. I slowed down instinctively, unsure of what she was doing out there in the middle of nowhere. As I got closer, she raised her arm and pointed down the road, her hand trembling slightly. I rolled down my window a crack, the cold air rushing in. "Are you okay?" I called out, but she didn't respond. She just kept pointing, her face hidden in the shadows of her hat. Something about her stillness unsettled me, and I decided not to stop. I rolled up the window and drove past her, glancing in the rearview mirror. As I went, she was gone. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. How could she have disappeared so quickly? The road was straight, with no place to hide. I stared into the fog behind me, but there was no sign of her. After a few moments, I convinced myself that it must have been a trick of the fog, or my tired eyes playing games. I took a deep breath and continued driving. A few miles later, my car began to sputter. The engine groaned, and the dashboard lights flickered before the car rolled to a stop. I sat there, stunned, as the silence pressed in around me. The gas gauge showed I still had a full tank. So why had the car stopped? I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, I thought bitterly. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, I was completely cut off. I considered waiting it out, but the idea of sitting in the darkened car with that strange woman somewhere behind me was too much. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out into the cold night air. The fog was even thicker now, swirling around me like a living thing. I shivered, the chill cutting straight to my bones. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, though I had no idea what I was looking for. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. "Help me." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. I swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the fog in jittery arcs. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Help me." The voice came again, closer this time. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. The woman from the side of the road was standing a few feet away, her dark coat billowing slightly in the breeze. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She lifted her head slowly, and for the first time, I saw her face, or rather, what was left of it. Her skin was pale and stretched tightly over her bones, her eyes sunken and empty. Her lips moved, but the words were barely audible. "Help me!" I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam flickered as it hit the ground, casting eerie shadows that danced around her figure. I scrambled to pick it up, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold on to it. When I managed to get the beam steady, she was gone. I bolted back to the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands fumbled with the keys as I tried to start the engine, but it was no use. The car remained dead. I sat there, hyperventilating, as the fog closed in around me. The whisper came again, this time right outside the car. "Help me!" I screamed, the sound echoing in the confined space of the car. Suddenly, the windows began to fog up, but not from the inside. Handprints appeared, pressing against the glass from the outside, smearing across the windows as if something or someone was trying to get in. I shut my eyes, clutching the keys tightly in my hand. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself over and over. "This isn't real." When I opened my eyes, the handprints were gone. The fog outside had begun to lift slightly, and the oppressive silence was broken by the faint sound of an engine. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. I stumbled out of the car, waving my arms frantically. The vehicle slowed to a stop, and an older man rolled down his window. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. I nodded, unable to form words. He offered to give me a ride to the nearest town, and I didn't hesitate to accept. As I climbed into his truck, I glanced back at my car one last time. The woman was standing beside it, her empty eyes watching me as we drove away. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the image of her face or the sound of her voice. I never went back to retrieve my car, opting instead to have it towed and sold for scrap. But sometimes, late at night, I hear her whisper in my dreams, "Help me." And I wonder if, one day, I'll wake up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. Story number 14. Nestled on a jagged coastline, battered by relentless waves, stood the Harrow's Edge Lighthouse, a towering sentinel of stone that had guided countless ships to safety. Its light was a beacon in the darkest storms, and its keeper, Elias Marlowe, was as much a part of it as the stones that formed its foundation. For over 3 decades, Elias had tended the lighthouse alone, his life consumed by the rhythmic pattern of its rotating beam and the endless roar of the sea. But one stormy evening, Elias vanished. The village nearby was accustomed to storms that made the sky churn like an angry cauldron. But the disappearance of Elias was something they could neither explain nor forget. It wasn't until the light from the lighthouse failed to shine that the villagers realized something was wrong. Ships were at risk, and the villagers knew they couldn't delay investigating. A small party of brave men volunteered to check the lighthouse. Among them was Arthur Crane, a fisherman with a knack for solving puzzles. He had always been fascinated by Elias's solitary life and the mysteries that came with it. The path to the lighthouse was treacherous. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at their clothes and throwing icy spray into their faces. When they finally reached the lighthouse, the door stood slightly ajar, creaking ominously with each gust of wind. "Elias," Arthur called, stepping inside. His voice echoed through the empty space, swallowed by the eerie silence that lingered within. The interior of the lighthouse was untouched, almost pristine. The lantern room at the top was still intact, the great Fresnel lens glinting faintly in the dim light. A half-eaten meal sat on the table in the keeper's quarters, as if Elias had left in a hurry. As Arthur and the others searched, they found no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away from the lighthouse, and no indication that Elias had planned to leave. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. But Arthur found something else. Elias's logbook. The journal was meticulously kept, each entry written in the same precise handwriting. The final entry, however, was different. The words were scrawled hastily, almost illegible. The storm speaks. It calls my name. I must go. Beneath the hurried script was a crude drawing of what appeared to be a figure standing in the waves. Its arms outstretched as if beckoning. Arthur stared at the drawing, a chill creeping down his spine. "Look at this," he said, showing the others. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado now replaced with a growing sense of dread. "Do you think he went out into the storm?" one of them asked. Arthur shook his head. "There's no way anyone could survive out there. Not in these conditions." Despite their misgivings, the men searched the rocky shoreline around the lighthouse, calling Elias's name into the wind. But their efforts were futile. Elias was gone, leaving only his cryptic words and the haunting sketch behind. The villagers took turns manning the lighthouse in Elias's absence, but the light seemed dimmer without him. Over time, stories began to circulate about what had happened that night. Some said Elias had been taken by the sea, claimed by the very waves he had spent his life protecting others from. Others whispered of something darker, something ancient that had lured him away. Arthur couldn't let it go. The image of the figure in the logbook haunted him, its outstretched arms a constant reminder of the mystery he couldn't solve. He began poring over old records and legends, searching for anything that could explain Elias's disappearance. That's when he stumbled upon the tale of the Siren of Harrow's Edge. The legend spoke of a creature that lurked in the waters near the lighthouse, a being that could mimic the voices of the living and lure its victims into the sea. Sailors claimed to have heard it singing on foggy nights, its mournful melody cutting through the din of the waves. Arthur dismissed the story as superstition, a way for sailors to explain the tragedies that befell them. But the more he read, the more he began to see patterns. Disappearances near the lighthouse, strange sounds reported by passing ships, and now, Elias's cryptic final entry. One night, driven by a mix of determination and fear, Arthur decided to spend the night in the lighthouse alone. He brought Elias's logbook with him, convinced that the answers he sought were somewhere within its pages. The storm arrived just after midnight. The wind screamed, rattling the windows and making the lighthouse shudder. Arthur lit the lantern and sat by the window, staring out at the churning sea. And then he heard it. Story number 15. Blackwood Manor stood on the edge of a dense forest, its once grand facade weathered by time and neglect. The locals whispered tales of ghostly apparitions and eerie music that echoed from its halls on the moonless nights. Few dared to venture near the estate, especially after sundown, for fear of encountering the Phantom of Blackwood. For decades, the story of the Phantom had been passed down in hushed tones. It was said that Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the last of the Blackwood lineage, had vanished mysteriously on the night of her engagement ball. She had been a vision of beauty, dressed in a flowing ivory gown, her laughter ringing through the halls as she danced with her fiancé, Lord Marcus Devereux. But when the clock struck midnight, she disappeared, leaving behind only her engagement ring, which lay abandoned on the grand staircase. The search for Eleanor had been exhaustive, but no trace of her was ever found. Over time, the manor fell into disrepair, and the tale of her disappearance became a chilling legend. Some claimed to see her ghostly figure wandering the halls, her eyes filled with sorrow, while others heard her haunting melody played on the grand piano in the music room. Despite the warnings, Clara Ashworth, a young journalist with a passion for uncovering the truth, decided to investigate the legend of Blackwood Manor. She had grown up hearing the stories and had always been drawn to mysteries that others feared to touch. Armed with her camera, a notebook, and an unshakable resolve, she set out for the manor on a foggy autumn evening. As Clara approached the towering gates of Blackwood Manor, a chill ran down her spine. The iron gates creaked open with a groan that echoed into the stillness, as if inviting her in. The long driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the once pristine fountain in front of the manor was now a moss-covered relic. The front doors of the manor stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Clara hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and damp wood. Her flashlight illuminated the grand foyer, revealing a sweeping staircase covered in a thick layer of dust. Portraits of the Blackwood family lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every move. Clara's first stop was the music room, where the Phantom's melody was often heard. The grand piano stood in the center of the room, its once polished surface now dulled with age. As she ran her fingers over the keys, a sudden chill enveloped her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A soft, haunting melody filled the air. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The piano was playing itself. The notes were melancholic, each one resonating with an otherworldly sorrow. Gathering her courage, Clara pulled out her camera and began recording. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Clara felt a presence behind her and spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced as she realized she was no longer alone. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara explored the rest of the manor. She found Eleanor's bedroom, untouched since the night of her disappearance. The vanity table still held a silver hairbrush and a bottle of perfume, its scent faint but lingering. A diary lay open on the bed, its pages yellowed with age. Clara carefully picked up the diary and began to read. Eleanor's entries painted a picture of a woman deeply in love, but plagued by a growing sense of unease. She wrote of strange shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the night, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The final entry sent shivers down Clara's spine. "Tonight is the engagement ball. I should be happy, but the shadows grow bolder, their whispers louder. I fear they will take me before I can say my vows. If anyone finds this, know that I loved Marcus with all my heart." Clara's investigation led her to the basement, a place the locals spoke of with dread. The door was hidden behind a tapestry, its rusted hinges protesting as she pushed it open. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness. The basement was vast and labyrinthine, with walls lined with shelves holding forgotten relics. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface etched with symbols Clara didn't recognize. A faint, glowing light emanated from a crack in the floor beneath the altar. As Clara approached, a sudden gust of wind extinguished her flashlight, plunging her into darkness. The glowing light intensified, and a figure began to materialize. It was Eleanor, her ethereal form shimmering like moonlight on water. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, and her lips moved as if speaking, but no sound came out. "Eleanor," Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "What happened to you?" Eleanor raised a translucent hand, pointing to the altar. The symbols on its surface began to glow, and Clara heard the whispers Eleanor had described in her diary. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, their roughly tone menacing. Clara realized the altar was the source of the curse that had trapped Eleanor. Summoning her courage, she searched the shelves for anything that could help. She found an old journal belonging to Marcus Devereaux, which detailed his desperate attempts to save Eleanor. According to the journal, the Blackwood family had been cursed generations ago by a vengeful sorcerer. The curse would claim the soul of the family's most beloved member on a night of celebration. Marcus had tried to break the curse but had failed. His love for Eleanor not enough to overcome the dark magic. Clara knew she had to finish what Marcus had started. She followed the instructions in the journal, using the items stored in the basement to perform a ritual to dispel the curse. As she chanted the incantation, the whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. Eleanor's spirit began to fade, her expression one of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. With a final burst of light, the altar cracked and crumbled, and the whispers ceased. The air grew still, and a sense of peace settled over the manor. Clara emerged from the basement, her body trembling from the ordeal. She looked around the manor one last time, feeling a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. Eleanor was free, but the legacy of Blackwood Manor would never be forgotten. As Clara walked away from the manor, the first rays of dawn broke through the fog. The once ominous silhouette of Blackwood Manor seemed less foreboding, as if the darkness that had gripped it for so long had finally lifted. The story of Blackwood Manor and its phantom would continue to be told, but thanks to Clara's bravery, it now had an ending filled with hope and redemption.